Hello, and welcome to Just Therapist Things, where we talk all things therapy. My name is Jordan, and I am an associate marriage and family therapist from Southern California. I currently work in a private practice where we focus on child anxiety reduction, and I also do some work for a nonprofit cancer support organization. Hello, everyone. Glad to have you here. I am currently studying for the California MFT Licensure Exam, and I thought it may be helpful to record some study materials to help others that are studying. I purchased my study materials from Jerry Grossman, and it has been great. I appreciate how they provide physical textbooks and flashcards, and also virtual study groups and practice tests. I hope this episode helps you on your journey to become a licensed marriage and family therapist in California. First, I am going to discuss some logistics about the California MFT exam. So the exam has 170 questions and you have 4 hours to complete it. The exam will be taken on a computer in an authorized testing center. There is a different variety in the questions, such as short sentences, questions, and vignettes. Each question has 4 possible answers, and it is up to you to decide which is the most correct. You have the ability during the test to flag a question and return back to it. Depending on the rules of the testing center, you may be allowed a certain amount of breaks during the test, and it is super important to take advantage of those breaks to use the restroom, get water, get a snack if needed. Good luck. We got this. Today, I will be discussing neurodevelopmental disorders, which you may see on the exam as part of the clinical evaluation section. The clinical evaluation section tests for knowledge of disorders, DSM diagnoses, and other special considerations. There is unfortunately no designated clinical evaluation section, but when I say this, then it just means questions that pertain to clinical evaluation. So under the umbrella of neurodevelopmental disorders, there are specifics of intellectual disabilities, communication disorders, ADHD, specific learning disorder, autism spectrum disorder, motor disorders, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So when I say other, then that is actually a specification. I have found while studying that there are usually with DSM diagnoses, there is an other specified or unspecified disorder listed. For example, a diagnosis could say other specified anxiety disorder or unspecified trauma stressor, and this is its own diagnosis. With other specified, there should be a code as to why it is other specified, and with unspecified, there is no code as to why. So other specified means that there is something coded with it, whether that's severity or duration. With unspecified, there is no code as to why. A code could be something such as other specified anxiety disorder, semicolon, short duration generalized anxiety. There could also be a separate specification for a disorder such as anxiety disorder due to a medical condition or anxiety disorder due to substance use. So other specified is coded, unspecified is non-coded, and watch for other situations where you would have to code for medical condition or substance use. I am going to go through the specific subtypes of neurodevelopmental disorders, and the first that I want to talk about is intellectual disabilities. So intellectual disability is actually a DSM diagnosis in itself, and it has thankfully replaced mental retardation in the DSM. Intellectual disability has no specific age of onset, but it shows up during the developmental stage. Intellectual disabilities include global deficits in adaptive functioning and general mental abilities with a need for support at home, work, or at school. General mental abilities include problem solving, reasoning, abstract thinking, academic learning, planning, and judgment. Examples of adaptive functioning are work, school, independent living, and social engagement. It is important to note that this diagnosis is not solely based on IQ scores. However, an IQ score of 70 or below is part of the diagnostic criteria. That is an intellectual disability. Another intellectual disability under the umbrella of neurodevelopmental disorders is global developmental delay. This is when an individual under the age of 5 years old does not reach expected developmental milestones. Examples of this are inability to walk, talk, learn new things, or interact with others at a developmentally appropriate time. There is a possibility that a child will catch up to other kids their age, although unlikely that the gap will bridge too much. Treatment for global developmental delays include physical therapy, occupational therapy, and behavior therapy, among others. Next is unspecified intellectual disability occurring when an individual is over the age of 5. Usually, this disability is unspecified because the severity is difficult to assess due to a co-occurring psychological problem or physical impairments. Now moving on to communication disorders. The first communication disorder to discuss is language disorder. This is diagnosed during the early developmental period with no specific age of onset, similar to intellectual disability. A language disorder diagnosis can come about when language abilities are below age expectations. This includes limited vocabulary, sentence structure, and conversation skills. Language disorder may also result in functional limitations in school or social interactions. Language disorder may co-occur with autism spectrum disorder or specific learning disorder. Child onset fluency disorder is another communication disorder that is also known as stuttering. This diagnosis is classified by a fluency issue that is not a result of a brain injury or trauma. It consists of disturbances in fluency and speech with sound or syllable repetition, physical tension while speaking, or blocking. Blocking is when no speech is produced during a conversation, and it can be silent or with audible noises. Child onset fluency disorder or stuttering can occur with other communication disorders and can be diagnosed in early childhood or during the developmental period. Another communication disorder is speech sound disorder, which is when a person has difficulty with speech sounds that prevents communication. Onset is during the early developmental period. A difference in this diagnosis is that this diagnosis is due to a physical, neurological, or medical condition. This disorder is characterized as persistent difficulty with speech sounds that prevents effective communication. Next is social pragmatic communication disorder, which is an impairment in verbal and nonverbal communication. This disorder can only be diagnosed if autism spectrum disorder is ruled out first. It is commonly diagnosed in the early developmental period. This disorder involves difficulties in taking turns, using metaphors, making inferences, greetings, and matching the needs of the listener. Lastly, there are unspecified communication disorders, which is when criteria for another communication disorder is not met and the reason is unspecified. Next, let's talk about motor disorders. Motor disorders consist of deficient or delayed motor skills, which are not due to a physical challenge. It is necessary to rule out OCD and ASD. The first of the motor disorders is developmental coordination disorder, which encompasses coordination problems starting in the early developmental period or delays in achieving milestones or basic motor skills. Examples could be poor balance, delay in walking or crawling, inability to catch, throw, write, those sort of things. And to have a diagnosis, This cannot be due to a medical condition. Next is stereotypic movement disorder, which are repetitive, purposeless motor behaviors that start in early development. To warrant a diagnosis, these behaviors are not due to effects of substance use, autism spectrum disorder, or another medical condition. Examples include hand waving, body rocking, biting, etc. You need to specify if this diagnosis comes with or without self-injurious behavior. A large subsection of motor disorders are tic disorders. Tics are sudden, involuntary, and recurrent movements or vocalizations. Tics are usually increased by stress and lessened by relaxation. The first of the tic disorders, and the most well-known, is Tourette's disorder, which is diagnosed before the age of 18. For a Tourette's diagnosis, multiple motor tics and one or more vocal tic must be present for more than 1 year. Next is persistent or chronic motor or vocal tic disorder, and this is also diagnosed before age 18, and symptoms must be present for more than a year. The difference between this and Tourette's is that persistent motor or vocal tic disorder has either motor or vocal tics, but not both. The cause is not due to substance or medical condition, and it is necessary to specify which type of tic, motor or vocal, is present. Provisional tic disorder is the same as persistent and Tourette's, except the symptoms are present for less than 1 year. This diagnosis can have motor and or vocal tics. There is also other specified and unspecified tic disorder, which, as said in the intro, means that the clinician specifies or does not specify reasons that criteria are unmet for the other disorders. Another neurodevelopmental diagnosis is specific learning disorder, which constitutes difficulties in learning basic academic skills that is not appropriate to the person's developmental age. These challenges must occur for at least 6 months, and they may be diagnosed in adults if there is documented history. It is important to note that learning disorders are not measured by IQ. For specific learning disorders, you need to code by the specifiers of impairment in reading, impairment in writing, or impairment in mathematics. Now moving on to autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. An important note is that persistent developmental disorder is not in the DSM anymore because it is now ASD. So if you see persistent developmental disorder on the exam, it is automatically incorrect. ASD typically has an onset in the early developmental period and has 2 symptom criteria with a variety of severity. The first domain is social communication or interaction impairments, and the second is repetitive or restrictive behavior patterns. To meet diagnostic criteria, an individual must have 3 identifiable social communication delays and at least 2 repetitive or restricted behaviors. Social communication delays include poor use of nonverbal communication, language impairment, impaired ability to develop and maintain relationships, impaired conversation, or lack of social initiation. Restricted or repetitive behavior includes repetitive speech, behaviors or use of objects, ritualized patterns, resistance to change, highly fixated interests, and hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input. Next is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. ADHD is typically diagnosed before age 12, and symptoms must occur in 2 or more contexts for at least 6 months. The behaviors and symptoms must be disruptive and impair home, social, and school functioning. These symptoms need to be ruled out from anxiety disorders, personality disorders, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, or dissociative disorders. And the symptoms are not due to oppositional behavior or failure to understand tasks. There can, however, be a co-occurrence. With ADHD, it is important to code by presentation. There are 3 subtypes of ADHD, which are combined presentation, primarily inattentive presentation, or primarily hyperactive or impulsive presentation. For a diagnosis to be primarily inattentive or hyperactive, there needs to be 5 or 6 symptoms, and for combined presentation, there must be 5 or 6 symptoms of each. Lastly, there is other specified or unspecified ADHD, and you know what that means, which is if the clinician chooses to specify or not why the individual does not meet the typical diagnostic criteria. So to recap, neurodevelopmental disorders is the umbrella term for a wide variety of diagnoses. Neurodevelopmental disorders include intellectual disabilities, with the subtypes of the intellectual disability disorder diagnosis, global developmental delay, and unspecified intellectual disability. There are also communication disorders such as language disorder, childhood onset fluency disorder, aka stuttering, social pragmatic communication disorder, and unspecified communication disorder. There is also autism spectrum disorder, ADHD with subtype specifiers, specific learning disorder, and motor disorders. Motor disorders include developmental coordination disorder, stereotypic movement disorder, tic disorders, and unspecified or other specified. Lastly, there are general, unspecified, or other specified neurodevelopmental disorders. I hope this recording helps you and me to study for and pass the California MFT Licensure Exam. Stay tuned for more episodes on study topics. Thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.